Hello, world, and welcome in to the In My Footsteps podcast. I am Christopher Setterland, coming to you from the vacation destination known as Cape Cod, Massachusetts, and this is a special bonus episode. It is episode 50. The first thing I have to do is apologize right off the bat because I am recording this with very little voice. I was sick for several days, and unfortunately, the last thing to come back has been my voice, and I've been trying to get this right, and I sound like a cross between Barry White and a 12-year-old just starting to go through puberty, so you're going to get a lot of that right now. So as I said, this is a bonus episode. It's going to double as a holiday episode, an end-of-year retrospective episode, and celebration, because 50 episodes is a lot. It's a lot of work that goes into each episode, research, recording and editing and posting and marketing and all that good stuff. And I wanted to make sure I got this done and got it recorded and up on time, because I am so grateful to all of you who listen, and I feel like I owe it to you to get you the episode that I have been promoting. I promoted it last week. But don't feel bad for me, because as bad as I sound, I feel great. So it's kind of a funny mix here. But I'm going to soldier through, and we're going to get through episode 50, and it's going to be great. And thank you all for tuning in. I want to start off with the holiday part and wish you all happy holidays, whatever you may celebrate. I celebrate Christmas, so I always say Merry Christmas, but whatever you may celebrate, I hope it's a great holiday. I hope that you can celebrate with as many family and friends, loved ones as possible. I know that this is definitely not the same as typical holiday seasons, just like last year wasn't. It's only slightly better, but hopefully it makes you appreciate those old days, those holidays, and maybe next year will be better and you'll appreciate it more. I know I will. I know those days growing up with 5 of us kids and just big family and huge celebrations, and they could get kind of overwhelming at times when you were younger. And now it's like it's all I wish for is to have all the family together, which we haven't had in so long. I am hoping to get to see as much of my family as I can. It will not be all at once, just because of the way the world is right now. And I hope you get to see at least some people for your own mental health, because that's another thing. I mentioned a lot about leaning into what makes you happy for your own mental health. And I've mentioned the holidays, as great as they are, and they're my favorite time of year, they can be rough for some people that are away from their family and friends. So just do your best to stay connected to those that matter, whether you see them or not in person, because it's good for your mental health. So it's hard to believe that this is the last episode of 2021. I began the year on episode 6, and that was where I interviewed Coach K.O., Kaylin Orr, and it's funny how things kind of come full circle, because now she and I are working together again at Mind, Body, Spine Chiropractic in Brewster. If you all want to come in and train with us, we're going to have a big 2022 coming up, as we've got a small group training center opening as part of Mind, Body, Spine. It's going to be called Cape Kettlebell, and there'll be a lot more coming from that. But I just find it interesting that when I interviewed Kaylin way back in January, I wasn't working at Mind, Body, Spine, and I was just interviewing her to help her showcase her own business. And here we are now working together again. So it's wild how things kind of work out that way. When I started the podcast last year, I did it every other week because I wasn't sure with my work schedule if I would have the time to do a weekly podcast. And when I started 2021, I realized I actually might have the time, and I definitely had the material to get it done. I didn't do a lot of interviews with people, but I did do the interview with Kaylin. I interviewed my sister Katie Marks for her amazing company, Wear Your Wish, clothing and apparel. You hear my ads for it basically every week. I interviewed my buddy Steve for the initial dedication to the craft photography segment, and Chef Mason Prime at the Cleat and Anchor in Dennisport. In 2022, I'm sure we'll see more interviews. I don't know how many. It's kind of a different setup, where what I do right now is I call it like the patchwork quilt, with the travel and lifestyle and nostalgia and history all stitched together. the interview thing is a whole different animal. But if you have interest in more interviews, or if maybe people listening want to be interviewed for the podcast, if you've got something relevant to the podcast, you never know. And coming up in 2 weeks, when we start 2022, episode 51 is actually going to kick off with an interview, ironically. As you heard me mention last week, it's going to be my old friend, my sister's old friend, Crystal Joy Smith, and her first book, her cookbook, Kiki's Cape Cod Kitchen. And we're going to have a video where she's going to make stuff. It's going to be like a regular old cooking show. I can't wait for that. But like I said, looking back at the beginning of this year, where I was and where I am and where things are, it's wild how things change. I had a far different day job because, as you know, the podcast is not my full-time gig. I wish it was, but that's not in the cards right now. So you got to have a day job to pay the bills. And kicking off January, I had a terrible job, just a really bad, toxic environment with some people that I don't know how they kept their jobs. And it was so bad that I actually left that job without another job to fall back on because for my own mental health. When I tell you take care of your own mental health, I'm living proof. I literally left a toxic job just because I could not take the awfulness that I was dealing with there. And you've got to believe that there's a plan for that. I had no idea what was coming, but within a few months, I had found Mind, Body, Spine Chiropractic and the amazing Dr. Michael Singleton. So it was just luck, but also you got to kind of bet on yourself and believe in yourself that there's something better for you out there, that no bad situation is permanent. I released my 6th book this year back in the spring, Iconic Hotels and Motels of Cape Cod. You've heard me mention it a lot, where you can get it. My website, ChristopherSutherland.com. But that was back in episode 21. That seems like a lifetime ago. But it was this year that that book came out. And I got used to doing Zoom events, whereas I used to do them in person. I actually got to do one in-person event this year. And it was like a weird anomaly compared to the normal sitting at my couch with my laptop open and talking to a screen, basically. I remember my introduction to doing Zoom events was when I interviewed my nieces, Kaylee and Emma, for episode 9, a segment called COVID in College, how they were dealing with the pandemic while being in college. And that was a lot of fun because it doubled as a chance to get to spend some time with them because, you know, they're growing up so fast, all my nieces and nephews. And it's like eventually they're going to all be gone and scattered about wherever they go. So any chance I get to spend time with them, even via laptop screen, is great. It was a weird mix because this year felt like it flew by, but yet it also dragged on at times. I don't know if it felt that way for you out there, but for me it sure did. Like I mentioned how long ago it felt that I released my 6th book. That was May, which, I mean, yeah, it's 7 months ago, but it feels longer. And that's how it feels when I think back to the loss of my Nina back in March. It feels like it was forever ago, but yet it feels like yesterday. And maybe it's just something when you lose a loved one that it can be both ways. I talked a lot about my Nina and her life in episode 15 and how she was this little ball of fire and class and style and toughness all wrapped into one. I was lucky that I was able to be 43 years old and still have a grandparent alive. Spending time with them made me feel like I was still a child, even though I am far from that. So when she passed away back in March, it was like the end of a chapter of life. And it's sad, and we all miss her. But in my mind, I know she's in a far better place with my grandpa. They were married over 70 years. I know she didn't want to be away from him, so she's with him now. You know, it's interesting as far as 2021 and the podcast goes. I found the more that I went along, the more I kind of peeled back the curtain of my own life and story for all of you. And I know some of you out there that are listening, your family, your friends, but there's a good number of you that I've never met in real life. So it's kind of weird to share things like the loss of my grandmother, or specifically the bonus episode I did, episode 30, about the loss of my childhood friend Matt and just how rough that was to deal with. It's cathartic in a way to share that and get it off my chest and out of my mind, but it's also, I guess, kind of risky because you really make yourself vulnerable by sharing things like that with people that don't know you. I appreciate all the positive feedback I've gotten over the year for the podcast, especially some of the harder things that I've tackled, like my own quitting drinking alcohol and things like that. Because a lot of the podcast is fun and games and history and retro and stuff like that. But I like to share as much as I can because you never know if something you've dealt with or something you're knowledgeable about could help someone else, and you don't know until you share it. And I'm sure coming up in 2022 as the podcast goes on, I'll find other topics like that to share. When this episode goes live, it'll be just a few days before Christmas. And obviously it gets me thinking about family. And this is the time of year 12 years ago where my Nana passed away. She was my first grandparent to pass away while I was alive. I had a grandfather that died many years before I was born, so I never met him. But my Nana was the first that I actually experienced. And I'm sure I'll share more about her throughout 2022 because there's so much that goes into what made her such a big, important part of my life and my entire family's lives. But speaking of 2022, what is coming up as far as the podcast goes then? Well, I can give you some hints. Like I said, I have the interview with Crystal coming up in 2 weeks for episode 51. I'm sure there will be other interviews. I've got a few in mind. I just don't know where they're going to fall in the calendar, but I have a few people that I'm going to chat with. My buddy Steve might make another appearance for Dedication to the Craft, level 2 of the classroom teachings. Coach KO, she's going to be in here again. When we get closer to Cape Kettlebell opening up, we're going to do an interview in the actual studio. So that might be February into March. And that leads into doing a little more in the fitness area. I'll definitely talk about my running career and races and embarrassing races. That might be coming up. But we'll have fitness topics and things like that just peppered in. Because when I say this podcast really is a buffet of my life and everything I enjoy, it really is. And now adding in more fitness stuff is really going to prove it. And I think you'll like it. It won't be preachy, I promise. And I'll be sharing some book event stories from the past, self-deprecating humor. That's always good. I'll share some of my embarrassing ones so you can laugh. There'll definitely be an opportunity to promote more local businesses beyond just Wear Your Wish that I do every week, because that's a big thing. People that are from the area, Cape Cod and Massachusetts, that are listening to this, it's really important to promote the local businesses that help keep this place alive and kicking, especially in the wintertime. So if you're a small business or a local business and you're interested in that, I've been just doing it for free. No, paying me to advertise your stuff, especially if you're local and I know you. That kind of helps too. I like helping my friends out. A lot of it comes down to adapting to what topics do well and kind of seeing where your audience is from. And that's a big benefit. This podcast is hosted by Buzzsprout. That's where it starts, and it kind of gets sent out to all the other Apple, Spotify, Pandora, all that. It allows me to see where my audience is from so that I can kind of gear things towards that. You know, if a lot of people are from Massachusetts listening to the podcast, I'm not going to talk a lot about Minnesota or North Dakota because it's less relevant to the people here, if that makes sense. And obviously I do have a recency bias. I live in New England, so I want to talk about all things New England on the podcast. So that's not going to change. A lot of it comes down to feedback from the people who listen. And that's all of you. What you like, let me know. If it's things that I've talked about over the last 50 episodes or things you want to hear about, local history, Cape Cod, Massachusetts, New England. I've noticed my true crime stuff has done better, so maybe there'll be more murder stories coming up in 2022. But a lot of it's the interaction. That's why I do the live streams Fridays at 8 p.m. on Instagram, just to engage with people. And sure, it's a lot of family and friends, which is really an extra bonus. But I enjoy hearing from people that listen to the podcast and let me know what they enjoy. And even if you don't tune into the live streams, you can always shoot me an email at christophersetterland@gmail.com or visit my website, ChristopherSetterland.com, and shoot me a message through there. And just let me know what you think of the podcast, because now we're 50 episodes deep. That's a lot of content that I've put up there. And there's really no end in sight. I mean, even losing my voice can't stop me. How's it holding up? How is this working for your ears? I'm doing my best. I've got throat drops and I've got water trying to keep it going to get through this podcast. I've said it many times that any of you out there listening this can make your own podcast. Doing this is not particularly hard, and you don't need a lot of talent to do it or equipment. The main things you need are A, the desire to actually do it, and B, a topic that you're interested in that you can actually talk about and feel somewhat confident that you know what you're talking about, I guess. This podcast came about as a combination of a lot of things. It was mainly COVID and being locked down and needing some kind of an outlet to keep me from going crazy. And another part of it was being very unhappy at the job I was working at. I mentioned it before. I won't get back into it again, but it was just a terrible job that I was very unhappy at and kind of trapped at because of COVID. And it also came into quitting drinking and needing something else, almost a distraction to keep me away from alcohol. Everybody needs that hobby or something to fulfill that need, the creative outlet. And that's what the podcast became for me. A chance to talk about all these things that I'm passionate about, because whether it's like me with travel and history and 80s nostalgia, or it's something totally different, there's an audience for all this stuff. Really, if you have something you're passionate about and you make a podcast, you will find an audience if you stick with it. Because honestly, unless you're someone who's already previously established or famous, or you hit lightning in a bottle, you're going to need time to grow your audience. So you've got to have the patience too. Desire, patience, and a topic you're passionate about. And there's your podcast. I consider myself to be a fairly creative person besides the podcast, with writing and photography. So I need that kind of creative outlet. When I was a kid, I'm talking 12, 13 years old, I used to make my own radio shows with friends. And these were anything from game shows to skits about being at school or news reports and commercials. But it was a way to use your imagination to kind of create this whole program. And then I got into high school and I kind of graduated from the radio programs, and I spent all of my money on a camcorder to make skits with friends. So video skits, because I wanted to be a film director. And again, that was another way, the creative outlet. You come up with skit ideas, characters, stories about them, and you create them right there. And they may only be funny to you, but still, it's a creative outlet. Eventually that led into the whole writing, doing short stories and novels and poetry, song lyrics, but I can't play instruments, so the singer-songwriter dream died when I was in college. Everybody has that, something that they're good at, something that they're passionate about, that they can share with the world. It's just finding the actual time to do it, I suppose. Because if you're a mother of three, but you're an amazing painter, you may not have the time to do a podcast about the ins and outs of painting, or even paint at all, but you've still got that skill. And I didn't spend a lot on equipment to get this podcast going. I have a small digital mini recorder. I've got this microphone I'm talking into now. It's a Samson Q2U, which was literally the sweet spot between high quality and cheap. I've got my laptop that I had anyway, which I use Audacity as my software. I find music that is royalty free, so I don't get any copyright issues. That's where I got James River, my theme song by DJ Williams. And go visit djwilliamsmusic.com. I mention it off and on, and I always have a link to it in every episode. He's an amazing guitarist. That's why I love the song James River. And I make sure to play a lot of it at the end, so I'm sure you'll hear it in a few minutes. But go check his stuff out. So whether it's a podcast or it's something else creative, find your niche It's great for your mental health. It gives you this sense of accomplishment, like you're doing something more than just sitting around, which there's a lot of time to do that these days. But if this podcast could inspire one person to make their own podcast or do something with a skill that they have, that'll really make me feel great. But I wanted to wrap up here by thanking you all for listening to this podcast over the first 50 episodes. That's a lot of episodes. If you've listened to all of them and you're a In My Footsteps superstar or some cheesy name, thank you so much. There's literally hundreds of thousands of podcasts out there. So when you've got people that actually tune into yours, that really means a lot because there are so many choices. And we'll have a great 2022. I've got a lot of stuff coming up, and I'll be back for that. I want to make sure I wish all of you, again, happy holidays, Merry Christmas, whatever you may celebrate. I hope it's great. I hope it's filled with family and food and fun. I want to make sure I shout out all those special people to me. Let me try. Starting with my mother, my sisters, Kate, Lindsay, and Ashley, my brother, Matt, my stepfather, Serpa, my uncles, Bob, Steve, John, and Eric, my aunts, Kelly, Susan, Emma, Amy, my absolute favorite people on this planet, my 6 nieces and nephews, Kaylee, Emma, Liam, Landon, Lucas, and Sylvie, my father, my cousins, Tracy, Ryan, Patrick, Kathleen, Sarah, Keith, my crew at Mind, Body, Spine, Dr. Mike, Heather, Coach KO. We're going to kick ass in 2022. And a special group of friends, Steve, John, Barry, Garbett, and Greg, Crystal and Shayna, Deanna and Mike, Maui and Dawn, Monique, the people that I haven't seen in forever, but I miss. I hope all of you have an amazing holiday season. Hopefully 2022, this shit gets in gear and we can all actually get together again, because that's the big thing. You don't realize how much you miss people until you don't get to see them. You kind of take for granted that all these people are just floating around you in and out of life until they're not there anymore. So please make sure that you appreciate those you have, those that are around you. It shouldn't take a damn pandemic to learn that you've got a lot of special people in your life. So thank you all again for a great 2021 as far as the podcast goes. 50 amazing episodes. I'll be back in 2 weeks for episode 51. Find me all over social media, Twitter, Instagram. Check out the live streams Friday nights at 8. Visit ChristopherSutherland.com for my books, for my travel blog, all that stuff. So happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and I will see you all again next year when my voice will be back to normal. Thank you all again, and I'll talk to you all again soon.